and the sacred chickens consulted. In the great litany of Roman superstition, consulting with the sacred chickens has always been my personal favorite. A flock of chickens were always carried around with the army, and just before a battle, an augur would scatter feed in front of them. If the sacred chickens ate, it meant victory was assured, but if they did not, the prudent commander held up his attack for another day. Pulcher, however, had no time for such ridiculous piety, and when the sacred chickens refused to eat, he ordered them thrown overboard, saying famously, "If they're not hungry, maybe they're thirsty." He sailed off into battle, though how he expected to win without the approval of the sacred chickens is a mystery. The debacle that followed left the Carthaginians stronger than ever. Pulcher's fleet got started late and was noticed by Carthaginian lookouts before they were within striking distance. They immediately responded by outmaneuvering and trapping Pulcher's fleet against the coast, where they were smashed against the rocks. Of the 120 Roman ships that set sail, only 30 returned. The dream of taking Lillibom had now passed into complete fantasy. The other consul for the year attempted to reprovision the Roman troops left at Lillibom by sailing around the south end of the island, but lost all his ships in yet another storm. He himself managed to survive and make his way to Lillibom, where he declared an end to the siege and withdrew. When the First Punic War finally ended 8 years later, Lillibom remained unconquered. But the Romans were not done yet. They withdrew their troops to Mount Eryx, a mountain in the west center of the island. By taking this strategic high ground, they were able to bottle up the Carthaginian land forces in their two garrisons, Lillibom and Drepana. The war had now come full circle. The Romans controlled the land, and the Carthaginians the sea. Neither was strong enough to beat the other in their respective sphere of dominance, and a new stalemate commenced. By this time, though, both sides were broke and short of manpower and facing problems elsewhere. The Gauls were stirring on Rome's northern frontier, and North Africa was in revolt against Carthaginian rule. The enemies of Rome and Carthage seemed to have finally noticed that the two combatants were beating each other into a state of exhaustion in Sicily. So for the next 7 years, Sicily became a neglected, backwater war zone. The Carthaginians, under the command of a new general, Hamilcar Barca, was reduced to running a guerrilla war and hoping that the Romans would just quit the island out of frustration. The center of the action was at Mount Eryx, where the strongest Roman garrison was stationed, and where Hamilcar directed the majority of his attacks. In 244 BC, Hamilcar finally managed to drive the Romans out and hold the high ground for himself. For the next 3 years, he would use the mountain as a base while he prosecuted his asymmetrical war against the Romans, undermanned and undersupplied by the Carthaginian Senate, who, after a political party shift, had lost all interest in the war against Rome. Seeing Carthaginian interest at an all-time low, the Romans decided to make their final push to win the war. After failing first in North Africa and then at Lillibom, the Romans, eternal optimists that they were, decided that the time for victory had finally come. They built a new fleet, starting a navy from scratch for the fourth time of the war. The Carthaginian fleet had been removed from Sicily after the disappearance of Rome from the seas a few years earlier, and there was nothing standing in the way of the Romans as they once again blockaded Lillibom and Drepana, the last two Carthaginian outposts on the island. This time the blockades worked, and the garrisons were slowly starved out. The Carthaginians suddenly became interested in Sicily again, and launched their entire fleet to drive the Romans off. But the hastily mustered crews were this time less experienced than the Romans, who had been at sea for some time. Around the northwest coast of Sicily, the last battle of the war was fought, the Romans decisively routing the Carthaginian navy. The garrisons about to fall, and with no way of keeping himself provisioned, Hamilcar reluctantly opened negotiations with the Romans. The final treaty, hammered out by Hamilcar and his Roman counterpart, read, "There shall be peace between the Carthaginians and the Romans, subject to the approval by the Roman people, upon these conditions. The Carthaginians shall relinquish every part of Sicily. They are not to make war against Hiero, nor do anything to disturb the Syracusans or their allies. All the Roman prisoners will be returned without ransom, and a tribute of 200 talents of silver paid within 20 years. Returning to Carthage, Hamilcar immediately began to look elsewhere for an opportunity to make up for Carthage's loss of Sicily and set his sights on Spain. He did not forget the humiliation of having to abandon Mount Eryx, however, and as he sailed north with his eldest son Hannibal in tow, he made the 9-year-old boy swear an oath of eternal hatred for the Romans, which the boy did. It was an oath Hannibal never forgot, and he would dedicate his entire life to the destruction of the Romans, the mortal enemy of his family. The First Punic War was now over, and Rome was the clear victor. However, the peace settlement did not address the larger issues still facing the two strongest empires in the western Mediterranean. Yes, Rome had won control of Sicily, and the Carthaginians had been forced to retreat, but the North Africans were undeterred in their quest for territorial expansion. The First Punic War settled the issue of who controlled the island of Sicily, but did nothing to settle the larger issues of who controlled the greater Mediterranean. In that larger game, the Carthaginians still obviously felt confident that they could win. The First Punic War, as I said last week, was marked by poor judgment on both sides, and ironically, it was the victorious Romans who seemed to make more boneheaded moves than the defeated Carthaginians. Regulus blew an opportunity to end the war, and because he let his ego get in the way, the conflict dragged on 10 years longer than it should have. The neophyte Roman sailors managed to lose 2 entire fleets to storms they were warned about in advance, by the way, and another to Claudius Pulcher's botched midnight raid. If it had been anyone else, each of these disasters by themselves would have been enough to shut down the war, but the Romans were able to absorb the losses, and it was their deep pockets, more than battlefield skill, which they rode to victory. The Carthaginians, for their part, found themselves succumbing as much to the reputation of the Romans as anything else. Despite the fact that Xanthippus clearly demonstrated that the Romans could be beaten on land, the Carthaginians were reluctant to invest in their land forces. After the last of their fleet was dashed on the rocks in 248 BC, the Romans essentially ceded the water to Carthage. But with one theater of the war now shut down, the Carthaginians failed to capitalize on it and divert resources to the other theater, and left Hamilcar to run a guerrilla war on a shoestring budget, rather than give him men and money to prosecute a real ground attack. The winner of the First Punic War was always going to be the side that succeeded on the other team's field. So it went to the Romans, who finally raised one last navy. If the Carthaginians had sucked it up and done the same thing, only building an army rather than a navy, they may have succeeded in pushing the war-weary Romans off the island. It would have been an interesting historical turn had that occurred. The war marked the first time Rome fought outside of Italy, and had they lost, overseas fighting may have left a bad enough taste in their mouth that they would have contented themselves with merely an Italian empire. As it stood now, however, Rome's first overseas adventure had left them with a rich new province, and it merely whetted their appetite for more. Next week, we will cover the years between the First and Second Punic Wars. Rome would face a Gallic army pressing down from the north, and also make their first foray east, landing an army on the far side of the Adriatic. All the while, Carthage was consolidating its holdings in Spain. Both sides knew the peace between them could not last forever. It was only a matter of time before hostilities between the two great powers resumed. In 218 BC, the peace would finally break, and Hannibal Barca would make good on his oath, descend into Italy, and wreak havoc not just in the Roman countryside, but in the Roman mind. Welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 21, Interbellum. For both the Romans and the Carthaginians, the First Punic War had been an exhausting experience. Rome emerged in a better position geopolitically speaking, but both sides had been drained of money and manpower, and were significantly weaker for the great effort they had expended over Sicily. As a consequence, both sides were vulnerable to attack from opportunistic enemies. I will only briefly review the challenges faced by the North Africans during the interwar period, before moving on to a detailed look at the Roman confrontations with Gallic armies to the north and Illyrian pirates across the Adriatic, This is, after all, the history of Rome, not the history of Carthage. So to quickly sum up Carthage's major post-war problem, let me just say that the Carthaginians ignored one of life's basic rules. Do not stiff mercenaries. Essentially, the new party that had taken control of Carthage in the last years of the war saw the conflict with Rome as a diversion from their main objective, making money. When the war ended, the mercenaries arrived in North Africa from Sicily and patiently waited for their due payment. But the new Carthaginian government was strapped for cash and decided a good way to save money and reduce the final bill for the war would be to drastically cut payments to their soon-to-be ex-employees. How they thought this would not blow up in their face is still a mystery. When the Carthaginian paymasters arrived at the mercenary camp, the troops, who were beginning to lose their cool because they had not yet been paid, began to settle down. Yeah, there had been a delay, but the Carthaginians were good to their word, and here at last was the riches they had just spent years earning with their blood and sweat. The Carthaginian envoys, however, launched into a speech that I can only imagine sounds eerily familiar to employees who have listened to a layoff announcement. We want to thank everybody for their hard work. The future looks bright for Carthage. We just need to streamline our liquidity outflow to maximize our revenue streams going forward. So anyway, you're all fired, and oh, by the way, your severance packages have been canceled. To say the least, the mercenaries did not take this lying down. They did not write letters to the editor railing against the injustice of the new global economy as they touched up their resumes. They grabbed their swords and said, "Trying to screw us, eh? We'll see about that." For the next 3 years, Carthage was locked in a war with its ex-army, a very dicey proposition when the whole reason you hired the mercenaries in the first place was that you didn't have a homegrown army of your own to speak of. But Carthage found some change in the couch cushions and hired different mercenaries to fight the aggrieved mercenaries. Carthage eventually won the fight, but the whole thing wound up costing more than if the Carthaginians had just paid up in the first place. There's a lesson in there somewhere, something about how easy life is when you simply live up to your obligations and how difficult it becomes when you renege on promises. That, and always pay your mercenaries in full, plus 10%. The Romans, on the other hand, were not dealing with internal divisions, but rather external pressures. To put it broadly, there were two competing visions for the way the Roman Empire ought to grow, and two families who embodied those competing visions. On the one hand were the Claudii, who, as we have already seen, pushed for southern expansion and pressed for the invasion of Sicily. On the other hand were the Fabii, who looked north and pressed for Roman settlement of the Po Valley. At one point, the Etruscans had held this land, but by the time Veii was captured by Rome, the Po Valley had been lost to migrating Gallic tribes. So, for Rome, expansion north meant poking with a stick one of their most feared enemies, the Gauls. It had been 150 years since the sack of Rome, but the memory of barbarian hordes pouring through the gates was still fresh, and indeed, fear of the Gauls was a psychological demon the Romans would never fully overcome. But for the Fabii, this was immaterial. Rome's destiny was the conquest of the entire world, and they weren't going to let childish fears halt the inexorable advance of the empire. Rome did not explicitly pick a fight with the Gauls, but the permanent settlements they were building in Gallic territory were obviously going to spark some sort of response. In 241 BC, a single Gallic tribe rose up against the Romans, but were put down with ease. A few years later, in 236 BC, a piecemeal coalition of tribes and factions began to march south, but when they actually stood on the brink of engaging the legions, internal squabbles broke up the coalition, and the threat dematerialized